I was overshadowed by my family's favoritism toward my adopted sister, until her stunning secret was exposed at my birthday party. For as long as I can remember, my family revolved around Clara. I still remember the day she came into our lives. I was 5 years old, sitting on the living room floor with my crayons when my parents walked in carrying a baby bundled in pink. My mom beamed at me, crouching down to introduce my new sister. "This is Clara," she said, her voice full of the kind of excitement usually reserved for Christmas mornings. At first, I was thrilled. I didn't understand what adopted meant. I just thought I was getting a built-in playmate. I spent hours picking out stuffed animals for her crib and talking to her in my high-pitched, big sister voice. But as Clara grew, it became clear that she wasn't just a new addition to the family. She was the addition. My parents didn't just love her. They adored her in a way that felt performative, almost obsessive. When Clara took her first steps, they threw a party and invited everyone we knew. I was 7 then, and I remember standing in the corner, watching as my parents gushed over her wobbly movements like she'd won an Olympic gold medal. A year later, I brought home a science fair trophy, and while they congratulated me, it was half-hearted at best. My trophy was placed on a side shelf in the living room, barely visible, while Clara's preschool participation ribbons took center stage on the mantel. It wasn't just the big moments where the favoritism showed, it was in the little things, too. At dinner, they'd always ask Clara how her day was before even glancing in my direction. When she cried over a scraped knee, they rushed to comfort her like she'd broken a bone, while I was told to toughen up if I showed even a hint of emotion. As I got older, the imbalance only grew. When I graduated from high school as valedictorian, my parents clapped politely from the crowd. But when Clara barely scraped by with passing grades, they threw her a surprise graduation party, complete with catered food and a slideshow of her best moments. Even as an adult, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what I achieved, I'd always be second best in their eyes. But the worst part? I didn't hate Clara for any of it. I wanted to pin all my resentment on her, but I couldn't. Clara didn't ask to be the golden child. In her own way, she was kind to me, always offering me a shoulder to lean on when I was upset, even though she never fully understood why. Still, there was a bitterness that lingered between us, a silent wedge driven by our parents' favoritism. I wanted to be close to her, to have the kind of sisterly bond you see in movies, sleepovers where we shared secrets, road trips where we sang off-key to the radio. But it never felt possible. Every time Clara talked about her struggles, whether it was a bad breakup or stress over a job interview, I'd listen intently. But in the back of my mind, there was always a voice whispering, "Do you know how much harder you've made my life?" Clara, for all her kindness, was oblivious to the dynamic our parents had created. She didn't see how their favoritism had pushed me to work twice as hard just to be noticed. She didn't understand how lonely it felt to be the overlooked sibling, the one who was fine because I didn't demand their attention the way she did. I didn't hate her, but I couldn't love her the way I wanted to either. And the worst part was I didn't know if I ever could. My birthdays had always been a lackluster affair. Over the years, I'd learned not to expect much, just a family dinner with a store-bought cake, maybe a few half-hearted gifts. When I was younger, I'd watch with envy as Clara's birthdays turned into grand productions. One year, she had a princess-themed party with a real pony in the backyard. Another year, they rented out an entire skating rink. My birthdays, by contrast, were quiet, almost obligatory, and as much as I tried to act like I didn't care, it stung. This year, I decided to take control. I organized a small gathering at my house, inviting close friends and family. Nothing extravagant, just an evening of drinks, laughter, and good company. For once, I wanted my birthday to feel like it was about me. My parents showed up early, bringing a modest cake from the grocery store. They wished me a quick happy birthday before settling in, their usual energy subdued. And then Clara arrived. She was late, as always, but made an entrance like a movie star at a premiere. Her hair was perfectly styled, her dress designer, and her smile dazzling. "Happy birthday, sis," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around me in a dramatic hug. Everyone turned to watch, and for a moment, I felt like maybe she'd come to celebrate me. That moment didn't last. No sooner had Clara greeted me than she launched into a story about her new boyfriend, Max. She gushed about how they'd met, how he'd surprised her with flowers, and how he was the one. My parents' faces lit up, and they peppered her with questions. When will we meet him? What does he do for a living? Is he coming tonight? I stood there, holding a plate of appetizers, watching as the spotlight shifted entirely to her. No one noticed as I quietly lit the candles on my cake and blew them out while Clara described the romantic weekend getaway Max had planned for her. My friends did their best to keep me engaged, but I couldn't help feeling invisible in my own home. Clara didn't mean to steal the show. It was just her nature. And my parents, true to form, enabled it, hanging on her every word like she was the main attraction. The evening dragged on until a surprise guest arrived. My Aunt Lauren. Lauren's relationship with our family was complicated, to say the least. She and my mom had a long history of tension, though neither ever explained the source of it. Lauren was the black sheep of the family, outspoken, a little wild, and fiercely independent. We didn't see her often, but when she showed up, she had a way of commanding attention. As soon as she walked through the door, I could feel my mom tense. Lauren greeted me warmly, handing me a thoughtful gift, a journal with a beautiful leather cover. "Happy birthday, kiddo," she said, ruffling my hair like I was still a child. "Thanks, Aunt Lauren," I said, genuinely touched. She spent most of the evening sipping wine in the corner, watching the room with a sharp, almost calculating gaze. Every so often, her eyes would land on Clara, and her expression would tighten, like she was holding back words she wasn't ready to say. At one point, my mom pulled me aside, her tone curt. "Why did you invite Lauren?" she asked, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. "She's family," I replied, confused. "Why wouldn't I?" My mom didn't respond, but the look on her face was enough to confirm what I already knew. Lauren's presence wasn't welcome. As the night wound down, I found myself drawn to Lauren. She was standing by the kitchen island, swirling the last of her wine in the glass, when I approached her. "Thanks for coming," I said, leaning against the counter. She gave me a small smile. "Of course. I wouldn't miss it." We talked for a while, mostly about my work and her recent travels. It felt good to have someone who seemed genuinely interested in me, without any ulterior motives. But even as we chatted, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lauren was holding something back. There was a tension in her posture, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "I'm glad you invited me," she said after a pause, her voice softer. "There's something I've been meaning to talk to you about." Before I could ask what she meant, Clara's laughter rang out from the other room, and the moment was gone. Lauren's expression closed off, and she excused herself, saying she needed to leave. I watched her go, a knot forming in my stomach. Something was brewing, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And I had the sinking feeling that whatever it was would change everything. The night had already taken on an uncomfortable energy. My parents were playing their usual roles as Clara's doting audience. Lauren was hovering on the edges with her glass of wine, and I was doing my best to blend into the background. The small talk had dwindled, and people were starting to leave when Lauren decided to make her move. I don't know what set her off. Maybe it was the tension between her and my mom, maybe it was the wine, or maybe she'd just reached her breaking point. But as she stood near the fireplace, swirling the last of her Merlot, she dropped the words that sent my world spiraling. "You know, Clara's not just adopted," Lauren said, her voice casual, but her eyes sharp and unflinching. The room went dead silent. Even Clara stopped mid-sentence, her story about her boyfriend trailing off as she turned to face Lauren. My parents froze, their faces paling as if Lauren had just threatened them. "What are you talking about?" Clara asked, laughing nervously. She glanced around the room, looking for reassurance that this was some kind of joke. Lauren didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. She kept her gaze locked on my mom, her expression unreadable but heavy with something that felt like decades of bottled-up anger. "She's my daughter," Lauren said evenly, her voice steady. "You adopted her because you didn't want anyone to know I was pregnant." It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The words hung there, sharp and jagged, as if the very walls were struggling to process them. "What?" Clara's voice cracked. She looked from Lauren to my parents, her face a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Is this some kind of joke?" My mom opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. She glanced at my dad, her expression desperate, but he just buried his face in his hands. It was the first time I'd ever seen him look so small. Finally, my mom managed to choke out a single word, "Yes." Clara stumbled back, her hand gripping the edge of the couch as if she needed it to steady herself. "So, it's true," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes," my mom repeated, barely audible. "It's true. The dam broke." Clara's confusion turned to anger in an instant, her voice rising with every question. You've lied to me my entire life? You let me believe I was just some random baby you chose out of love, but all this time I was her daughter's." She pointed at Lauren, her hand shaking. Lauren didn't flinch. If anything, she looked relieved, like a weight she'd carried for decades had finally been lifted. "You deserve to know the truth," she said quietly. My mom snapped her head toward Lauren, her eyes blazing. "You had no right." "No right?" Lauren interrupted, her voice finally rising to match my mom's. "You think you had the right to keep this from her? From me? I gave her to you because you begged me to, because you said it was the only way to keep the family together. And what did you do? You turned her into your little golden child and erased me from the picture." The accusations flew fast and sharp, the years of tension between them unraveling in front of everyone. Clara stood in the middle of it, frozen, her hands covering her face as she tried to process what was happening. I should have said something. I should have stepped in, or at least tried to comfort Clara, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, my mind racing as I tried to piece together this new reality. Clara wasn't just my adopted sister. She was my cousin. Lauren wasn't just the family's black sheep. She was Clara's mother. As the shouting continued, Clara finally found her voice. "Enough," she screamed, silencing the room. Tears streamed down her face as she turned to my parents. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me go my whole life not knowing who I really am?" "We thought we were doing what was best for you," my mom said, her voice breaking. "You were just a baby. Lauren wasn't in a position to raise you, and we thought it would be easier this way." "Easier for who?" Clara snapped. "For me? Or for you?" My dad finally looked up, his eyes red and glassy. "We didn't mean to hurt you," he said. "We just wanted to protect you." Clara laughed bitterly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Protect me? You didn't protect me. You lied to me. You lied to all of us." She looked at me then, her eyes pleading. "Did you know?" I shook my head quickly. "No, Clara. I swear I didn't know." She nodded, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the night had finally crushed her. Without another word, she grabbed her purse and walked out the door, leaving the rest of us in stunned silence. In that moment, the family I thought I knew shattered into a million pieces. And I had no idea how we'd ever put it back together. The silence Clara left behind when she stormed out was short-lived. The moment the door slammed shut, the room exploded into chaos. My mom broke down sobbing. My dad tried and failed to say something coherent, and Lauren, still simmering with anger, poured herself another glass of wine and leaned against the kitchen counter like she had no regrets. "What were you thinking?" my mom wailed, turning to Lauren with a mix of fury and desperation. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've ruined everything." "Ruined what?" Lauren shot back, her voice sharp. "Your perfect little lie? The fantasy you built where you get to look like the saint who saved Clara while erasing me from her life." She didn't need to know. My mom cried, her voice cracking. "We were trying to protect her. She deserved a stable home. Not your mess." "Protect hers?" Lauren spat, slamming her wine glass on the counter, so hard I thought it might break. "You weren't protecting her. You were protecting yourself. You didn't want the shame of everyone knowing your little sister got pregnant out of wedlock. So you took her, claimed her as your own, and buried the truth like it would never come out." In the corner, my dad finally found his voice. "That's enough, Lauren," he said, his tone low and defeated. "This isn't helping anyone." "Neither did keeping your mouth shut for 24 years, Lauren shot back. "So forgive me if I don't care about your damage control routine." As they argued, I stood frozen, my mind spinning. The words flying around the room felt distant, almost muffled, like I was watching a movie on mute. Clara's reaction replayed in my mind on a loop. The shock, the anger, the tears. A part of me wanted to feel vindicated. For so long, I'd been the one sidelined, the one left in the shadow of Clara's pedestal. Finally, she was seeing the cracks in the perfect family narrative my parents had crafted. But instead of satisfaction, all I felt was a hollow, aching numbness. This wasn't just about Clara. It was about all of us. If my parents could keep a secret like this, something so monumental, so life-altering, what else had they lied about? Eventually, Lauren turned to me, her expression softening slightly. "I didn't mean for this to blow up your birthday," she said, almost apologetic. I shook my head, unable to find the words. What was I supposed to say? "It's fine?" Because it wasn't. Nothing about this was fine. "Why now?" I finally managed, my voice hoarse. Why did you tell her, Knight? Lauren sighed, running a hand through her hair. Because it was time, she said simply. Your mom and dad have been hiding behind this secret for decades, and it's done nothing but hurt everyone involved. Clara deserved to know the truth. But like this? Asked, my voice rising. At a party? In front of everyone? She shrugged. There's no good way to drop a bomb like that. At least now it's out in the open. Before I could respond, my mom spoke up, her voice shaking but firm. You had no right to tell her, Lauren. You gave her to us. You gave up that right the day you handed her over. Lauren's face hardened, her eyes narrowing. I didn't give her up, she said through gritted teeth. I made a sacrifice because you convinced me it was the only way. And I'm done pretending that was the right choice. The tension in the room was suffocating. My dad sat in silence, staring at the floor, while my mom glared at Lauren with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. I couldn't take it anymore. I need some air, I muttered, grabbing my coat and slipping out the door before anyone could stop me. Outside, the cool night air hit me like a wave, and I inhaled deeply, trying to steady myself. My thoughts were a chaotic mess, tangled and frayed. The image of Clara's face, her shock, her anger, her tears, flashed in my mind, and my chest ached with a mix of guilt and sadness. For so long, I'd resented her, envied her place in our family. But now? Now, I just felt sorry for her. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't asked to be caught in the crossfire of my parents' lies and Lauren's anger. And me? I didn't know where I stood anymore. My parents weren't just flawed, they were strangers, people capable of monumental deceit. And Lauren, for all her righteous fury, had chosen the most chaotic way possible to reveal the truth. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I could ever forgive my parents or if Clara would ever forgive any of us. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same. The days after the party felt like a strange, suffocating limbo. Clara had disappeared, emotionally if not physically. She didn't answer calls or texts from anyone, not me, not my parents, not even Lauren. Her social media accounts went dark, and every attempt I made to reach her ended in silence. When I finally managed to get her on the phone a week later, her voice was barely recognizable. It was hollow, like all the life had been drained out of her. I don't even know who I am anymore, she said. Everything I thought I knew about myself is a lie. I didn't know what to say. What do you say to someone who's just learned their entire identity has been fabricated? You're still you, I offered weakly, but even as I said it, I knew how empty it sounded. Clara let out a bitter laugh. Am I? She asked. Because it doesn't feel like it. I thought I was your sister. I thought I was mom and dad's daughter. But now I'm what? Some secret love child they used to hide Aunt Lauren's mistakes? It's like my whole life has been one big lie. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but the truth was, I didn't know how to navigate this either. Clara had always been the center of our family, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. Now, she was grappling with the fact that her pedestal had been built on a foundation of deceit. I thought back to the years of resentment I'd felt toward her, the bitterness that had quietly poisoned our relationship. In a way, I'd envied her oblivion. She didn't know what it felt like to be sidelined, to be treated like an afterthought. But now, the roles had shifted. For the first time, Clara was the one feeling lost, and it was painful to watch. I don't blame you, she said suddenly, her voice softer. I know how hard things have been for you, how unfair mom and dad have been. But I don't know if I can forgive them. I don't even know if I can face them. You don't have to decide that right now, I said gently. Just take it one day at a time. But even as I said it, I wondered how either of us would ever move past this. My parents weren't handling it any better. My mom spent most days locked in her room, emerging only for meals, and even then looking like a ghost of herself. When I tried to talk to her, she'd either burst into tears or lash out defensively. We were trying to do the right thing, she kept saying, like a mantra she needed to believe in order to keep going. My dad, on the other hand, seemed determined to avoid the topic entirely. He threw himself into work, leaving the house early and coming home late. On the rare occasions we were in the same room, he'd quickly change the subject if anything remotely related to Clara or Lauren came up. The house felt like a war zone, even in its silence. Every conversation was a potential landmine, and every glance carried an unspoken weight. I found myself walking on eggshells around both of them, unsure whether to push them to confront what they'd done or to let them wallow in their guilt. One night, As I sat in the living room scrolling mindlessly through my phone, my mom came in and sat across from me. Her eyes were red and puffy, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of tea. "I don't know how to fix this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought if we raised her as our own, it would be better for everyone. But now I've lost her. I've lost both of you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. For years, I'd felt invisible to her, overshadowed by Clara. And now, for the first time, she was acknowledging that I mattered. But it felt too little, too late. "You didn't just lose us," I said quietly. "You lied to us. You lied to Clara. And now you're dealing with the consequences." My mom flinched, tears spilling down her cheeks. She opened her mouth to respond, but I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up and left the room, leaving her alone with her guilt. The truth was, I didn't know if I could forgive her either. As for Lauren, she was uncharacteristically silent in the aftermath. I thought she might try to reach out to me or Clara, but days passed with no word from her. When I finally texted her to check in, she responded with a single line: "She needs time." So do I. I couldn't blame her. This wasn't just about Clara, it was about all of us, grappling with the fallout of a truth that had been buried for far too long. The family I'd grown up with was fractured beyond recognition, and I had no idea how, if it could ever be put back together. A week after the party, the silence in our fractured family finally broke. Clara agreed to meet with our parents, and she insisted I come too. "I need someone there," she said when she called me, her voice unsteady. "Someone who'll back me up if they try to twist things." I wasn't sure how much help I'd be, but I agreed. I wanted answers too. After everything that had happened, the facade of my parents as steadfast, moral figures had shattered, leaving behind a mess of half-truths and unanswered questions. We met at my parents' house on a chilly Saturday afternoon. The atmosphere inside was oppressive, the kind of tension that makes every sound feel louder than it should be. My mom sat on the edge of the couch, clutching a tissue, while my dad paced near the fireplace, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Clara and I sat across from them, a united front for the first time in years. "How could you do this to me?" Clara began, her voice trembling but loud enough to echo in the silent room. "How could you lie to me for my entire life?" My mom flinched, as if the words had physically struck her. "Clara, please, you have to understand." "Understand what?" Clara snapped, cutting her off. "That you made decisions for me without giving me a choice? That you let me grow up believing one thing while you knew the truth?" My mom's eyes filled with tears, and she clutched the tissue tighter. "We were trying to protect you," she said, her voice breaking. "Lauren wasn't in a position to raise you. She was young, and she didn't have the means. We thought this was the best thing for you." Clara let out a bitter laugh, her hands shaking in her lap. "You didn't do this for me," she said, her voice low but cutting. "You did this to cover your own shame. You made me your daughter, so you wouldn't have to deal with what people would say about her. Don't act like this was some selfless act of love." The words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and unyielding. My mom started sobbing, and my dad, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "It wasn't like that," he said, his voice firm but tired. "We thought we were doing the right thing. We wanted to give you a stable home, a family." Clara turned to him, her eyes blazing. "A family? Is that what you call this? A family built on lies? You let me think I was just some random adopted baby you chose out of love, but that was never the truth, was it? You chose me because you couldn't handle Lauren's mistakes becoming public." For the first time, I saw my parents not as the untouchable figures I'd grown up idolizing, but as flawed, scared people who had made a mess of everything. My mom was a wreck, crying into her tissue, while my dad stood there looking more helpless than I'd ever seen him. I don't understand why you didn't tell me," Clara said, her voice softening, though her tears still streamed down her face. "Why didn't you tell me when I was old enough to understand? Why did you wait until Lauren had to do it herself?" My mom looked up, her face streaked with tears. "We were afraid," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Afraid that you'd hate us. That you'd choose her over us." Clara stared at her, disbelief etched into every line of her face. "You lied to me because you were afraid I'd leave you?" She shook her head, laughing bitterly. "Well, congratulations. You've pretty much guaranteed it now." The words hit my mom like a freight train, and she broke down completely. My dad tried to comfort her, but Clara stood up, her movements abrupt and tense. "I can't do this," she said, turning to me. I can't sit here and listen to them try to justify what they did. I stood too, instinctively following her. My mom reached out as if to stop us, but Clara didn't look back. "You've already lost me," she said, her voice cold and resolute. "I just hope it was worth it." As we walked out of the house together, the weight of the confrontation settled heavily on my chest. I'd wanted answers, but all I felt was emptiness. For Clara, this was the beginning of a painful journey to rebuild her identity. For me, it was a stark reminder that the family I thought I knew had been built on illusions, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to salvage what was left. After confronting our parents, Clara's next move was predictable. She turned to Lauren. It wasn't like she had many options. Her trust in our parents had been obliterated, and I think she felt like Lauren was the only person who could give her a shred of honesty. I didn't blame her. Clara needed to fill the gaping hole left by the lies she'd grown up with, to piece together the parts of herself that had been hidden for so long. Lauren seemed open to it, at least at first. She invited Clara over for coffee, and they spent hours talking about the past, about the pregnancy, the adoption, and why Lauren had agreed to give her up. At first, Clara came back from those visits looking lighter, almost relieved, like she was finally uncovering pieces of a puzzle she didn't know she'd been trying to solve her whole life. But the relationship wasn't without its challenges. Lauren wasn't exactly the maternal type. She'd lived most of her life as a fiercely independent person, with no interest in the conventional roles of motherhood. Clara, meanwhile, wanted answers. She wanted connection. And those two desires didn't always align. One night, Clara called me after a particularly tense conversation with Lauren. Her voice was tight with frustration. "She keeps saying she gave me up because she thought it was the best thing for me," Clara said. "But how am I supposed to believe that? How can I trust her when she gave me away and then just disappeared from my life?" I didn't know how to respond. Part of me understood Lauren's perspective. She'd been young, scared, and likely overwhelmed by the pressure from my parents to do what they thought was best. But I also understood Clara's pain. She was trying to reconcile two versions of her story, the one she'd grown up with, where she was a chosen, adopted child, and the one she was now learning, where she was the byproduct of a family cover-up. "She's not perfect," I said carefully, "but I think she's trying. That's more than we can say for Mom and Dad right now." Clara sighed heavily. I want to believe her. But every time I think I'm starting to, I remember all the birthdays she missed, all the times she could have reached out but didn't. How do I get past that? I don't know, I admitted. But maybe it's not about getting past it. Maybe it's about figuring out how to live with it. Despite the tension, Clara kept seeing Lauren. She needed to, even if it wasn't always easy. Their conversations swung wildly between moments of connection and heated arguments. Lauren would tell her stories about her younger years, about her wild streak and her mistakes, and sometimes Clara would laugh. Other times, those stories seemed to hit a nerve. "You had time to party," Clara said during one of their arguments, her voice sharp. "But you didn't have time to be my mom?" Lauren didn't flinch. "I didn't give you up because I didn't want you," she said evenly. "I gave you up because I thought it was the best thing for you. Your parents made it clear that they could give you a better life than I could. I believed them. And do you still think that?" Clara asked bitterly. Lauren hesitated, and that silence said more than words ever could. Watching Clara go through this was painful. She was untangling decades of lies and half-truths, trying to understand who she really was and where she belonged. It made me realize something I hadn't fully confronted before. We were both victims of our parents' choices. For so long, I'd thought of Clara as the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. But now, I saw the cracks in her pedestal. She hadn't been unscathed by our parents' favoritism, it had just left different wounds. And as much as I hated to admit it, we were more alike than I'd ever realized. We were both trying to make sense of a family that had betrayed us. And we were both starting to realize that the answers we were looking for might never fully satisfy us. As Clara dug deeper into her relationship with Lauren and grappled with the lies that had shaped her life, I found myself reflecting on my own place in the family. For years, I'd been defined by my proximity to Clara. I was the sibling in the shadows, the one overlooked and underappreciated while Clara basked in the spotlight. At the time, it felt like a cruel injustice. Now, it felt like an anchor I needed to cut loose. The revelation about Clara had shaken my parents to their core, but it also left me feeling oddly unmoored. Without Clara as the centerpiece of the family dynamic, without the constant comparison and favoritism, who was I? What was my role? I couldn't just define myself by what I wasn't anymore. Not Clara, not the favorite, not the center of attention. I needed to figure out who I was. For years, I'd buried my feelings under layers of resentment, telling myself it was easier to be angry than to confront the pain of being sidelined. But now, with everything laid bare, I realized I couldn't keep carrying that bitterness. It wasn't just hurting my relationship with my family, it was hurting me. Reluctantly, I started therapy. It was something I'd avoided for years because the thought of unpacking my emotions felt overwhelming, like opening a Pandora's box I might never be able to close. But the first session surprised me. It wasn't just about rehashing the past, it was about understanding it, putting it into context, and figuring out how to move forward. Talking about my childhood felt like ripping open old wounds, but it was also cathartic. I talked about the science fair trophy that was overshadowed by Clara's participation ribbon, the way my accomplishments were met with polite nods while her mediocrity was celebrated, and the countless times I felt invisible. My therapist helped me see patterns I hadn't recognized before, how my parents' favoritism had shaped my self-esteem, how it had driven me to overachieve in the hopes of being noticed, and how it had left me with a constant need for external validation. But the most surprising revelation was this: I didn't need my parents' approval to feel worthy. That realization was both freeing and terrifying. For so long, I'd been chasing their validation like it was the key to my happiness. Letting go of that chase meant redefining what happiness looked like and realizing that it wasn't something they could give me. I started making small changes. I set boundaries with my parents, refusing to let their guilt trips or excuses pull me back into the dynamic that had hurt me for so long. I focused more on the relationships that brought me joy, my friends, my work, and even the tentative connection I was rebuilding with Clara. For the first time in my life, I felt free to define myself on my own terms. I wasn't just the other sibling anymore. I was someone with my own ambitions, my own strengths, and my own story. There were moments of doubt, of course. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering if I was being too harsh, if cutting off my parents emotionally was the right thing to do. But then I'd remind myself that setting boundaries wasn't about punishment, it was about protection. My journey was far from over, and I didn't have all the answers yet. But for the first time, I felt like I was heading in the right direction. And that was enough. In the months following the revelations that had upended our family, Clara and I found ourselves leaning on each other in a way we never had before. The shared pain of our upbringing, the lies, the favoritism, the emotional neglect, created a bond that hadn't existed when we were younger. For the first time, we weren't just siblings who coexisted in the same house. We were allies navigating the wreckage left by our parents. It started small. A text here, a phone call there. At first, the conversations were hesitant, like we were testing the waters. But as time went on, they became more frequent and honest. We talked about the big stuff, the secrets our parents had kept, the way their choices had shaped our lives, but also the little things. Clara told me about her favorite coffee shop where she went to think, and I told her about the new book I was reading. One night, we stayed on the phone for hours, talking about our dreams for the future. I don't know who I'm supposed to be anymore, Clara admitted. But maybe that's a good thing. For once, I get to figure it out for myself. I think that's the best thing you can do, I said. And you don't have to do it alone. For the first time in years, I felt like we were on the same side. Our parents, on the other hand, were a different story. My relationship with them remained strained, defined more by polite avoidance than meaningful conversation. My mom tried a few times to mend things, calling to check in or sending awkward texts asking how I was doing. But I wasn't ready to forgive her, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. Clara's relationship with them was even more fractured. She refused to return their calls and ignored their attempts to reach out. I need space, she told me. I can't even look at them right now without feeling like my whole life was a joke. Our parents didn't handle the rejection well. They had spent so long controlling the narrative, building a version of reality that suited them, and now that it was out of their hands, they were floundering. My dad retreated further into his work, while my mom's once overbearing energy seemed to collapse into itself. It was strange to see them like this, no longer the all-powerful figures who had loomed so large in my childhood, but flawed, uncertain people who didn't know how to fix what they'd broken. Despite everything, I felt a glimmer of hope. Clara and I were proof that healing was possible, even if it wasn't easy. Our bond was still fragile, built on years of pain and misunderstanding, but it was growing stronger with each conversation, each moment of shared understanding. One afternoon, we sat together at my kitchen table, drinking coffee and laughing about a silly memory from our childhood. For a brief moment, it felt like the weight of the past had lifted. "Do you think we'll ever be okay?" Clara asked, her voice softer than usual. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think we're getting there. Slowly." She smiled, and for the first time, I believed it. I don't know what the future holds for my family. The scars from this ordeal run deep, and some wounds may never fully heal. Every interaction with my parents feels like navigating a minefield, and I'm not naive enough to think that things will magically resolve. But for the first time, I feel like I'm in control of my own story. Clara and I are taking things one step at a time. Rebuilding our relationship hasn't been easy. It's a slow, deliberate process, marked by moments of vulnerability and discomfort. But it's also rewarding. We've had hard conversations, the kind we never would have had before. She shared how she always felt like something was missing in her life, even before she learned the truth, and I've opened up about how the years of favoritism made me feel invisible. "I wish I'd seen it sooner," she told me recently. "I was so caught up in being the favorite that I didn't realize how much it cost you." "It's not your fault," I said. And I meant it. Clara and I were both shaped by our parents' choices, but we're choosing to rise above them now. For the first time, our bond feels real, rooted in honesty, not the roles we were assigned growing up. As for my parents, I've set firm boundaries. My therapist helped me see that forgiveness doesn't have to mean forgetting or allowing them the same access to my life that they used to have. It's about protecting myself. They've tried to reach out, of course. My mom leaves long, rambling voicemails, alternating between apologies and excuses. My dad, true to form, sends curt texts, "Can we talk?" or "Let's put this behind us." I respond when I feel up to it, but I keep my distance. Whether they choose to respect my boundaries remains to be seen. But the difference now is that their choices no longer define mine. For so long, I lived for their approval, chasing a validation that was always just out of reach. Letting go of that need has been liberating. I no longer measure my worth by their praise or the lack of it. I'm learning to find value in my own accomplishments, to celebrate my wins without looking over my shoulder for their acknowledgement. The path forward isn't without its challenges. There are moments when the weight of it all still feels overwhelming, when memories of the past creep in, or when doubt whispers that I'm being too harsh. But those moments are fewer and farther between. The greatest gift I've given myself is the freedom to live for myself, to define my worth on my own terms, to let go of the bitterness that once consumed me and focus on building a future that feels authentic and fulfilling. As I sit here, writing this, I feel a sense of peace I haven't felt in years. My family may never look the way I once hoped it would, but that's okay. I'm learning to embrace the imperfect, to find joy in the relationships that matter, and let go of those that don't. For the first time in my life, I'm not living in someone else's shadow. I'm living for me, and that feels like the start of something beautiful.